Ever wonder how pilots navigate a hunk of metal weighing tons through the air?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it.
You're in the right place.
That's what we're here for.
Today's deep dive is all about those cool, complicated-looking flight instruments
Oh, yeah.
and what each one actually does. We've got diagrams, explanations, the works. So buckle up. You're about to level up your aviation knowledge.
What's fascinating is how they take basic physics like air pressure, even gyroscopic forces, and turn them into tools that tell you where you are, how fast you're going, all while you're up in the air. It's really elegant engineering.
Okay, so let's break down this instrument panel like it's a puzzle we're solving.
Okay.
Where do we even start?
The foundation is the pitot-static system.
All right, pitot-static system it is.
It might sound kind of intimidating,
Yeah.
but it's really the source of information for a lot of the key instruments.
Okay. I'm seeing a pitot tube and a static pressure chamber in our diagrams.
Right.
Tell me more.
So the pitot tube, you can often find it mounted on the wing or somewhere, sticking out into the oncoming air. It's this little L-shaped probe.
Okay.
And that front opening you're seeing in the diagram there,
Right.
that is measuring the total pressure, which is both the regular air pressure and the force of the air hitting it as the plane moves. That's what we call dynamic pressure.
So it's capturing how much the air is pushing against it.
Exactly. And then there's a tiny hole at the back of the pitot tube.
Okay.
And this one's sneaky. It's not exposed to that direct rush of air. It's just measuring the regular ambient air pressure, what we call static pressure.
Wait, so two openings on this one tiny tube, each with a different purpose. And that L shape, that's got to be important.
Like, you're sharp. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. The L shape keeps that front opening pointed directly into the oncoming air.
Oh, okay.
That's crucial for accurate dynamic pressure readings.
Makes sense. Like if you were trying to check the wind direction,
Right.
you'd want your weather vane pointed the right way.
Perfect analogy. Now, you know those covers you see on parked airplanes covering the pitot tubes?
Oh, right, the little socks.
So they're not just for show.
Are those really socks?
Those
Yeah.
socks are vital. They prevent anything, insects, dirt, from blocking the tube.
Oh, okay.
And a blocked pitot tube means inaccurate readings. And trust me, that's the last thing you want when you're flying.
Safety first. Okay, so that covers the pitot tube. What about this static pressure chamber?
So the static pressure chamber, think of it as a separate little chamber.
Okay.
It's often on the fuselage.
Okay.
And its whole job is to measure the static pressure, the air pressure surrounding the plane.
Okay.
And it's got these kind of strategically placed holes that let air in without any turbulence, giving a pure pressure reading.
And there's a backup too, right? I see something called an alternate static source.
You're on top of it.
I try to be.
That backup lives inside the cockpit, just in case the main static port gets blocked.
Redundancy is key. So we've got these pressure readings, total pressure, static pressure, and a backup static.
Right.
Where does it all go?
Think of this pressure data like signals being sent to different parts of the plane, telling the instruments what's up. So the airspeed indicator, it needs both the total and static pressure readings from the pitot tube.
Okay.
The altimeter and the vertical speed indicator, those two only care about that static pressure.
Okay, so like specialized sensors, each one tuned to a different aspect of flight.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's follow one of these signals.
Okay.
How does the airspeed indicator, or ASI, use this pressure data to tell us how fast the plane's going?
The ASI is all about comparing the difference between those two pressures. So it subtracts that static pressure from the total pressure,
Okay.
and the bigger that difference, the higher the airspeed.
So more speed, more force on that pitot tube, bigger pressure difference, higher reading on the ASI.
You got it. But there's a bit of a twist. What you see on the ASI is the indicated airspeed IAS. It's a direct reading, but there are a few other types of airspeed that matter.
I've heard this term, true airspeed.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Exactly. Think of it this way. IAS is what your instrument's telling you based on those pressure differences. True airspeed, or TAS, is your actual speed through the air mass.
So like if you were flying into a headwind, your IAS would be lower than your TAS because the wind is working against
We're
it.
getting it.
Okay.
And we can't forget calibrated airspeed, CES, which adjusts for instrument error.
Right.
And ground speed, GS, your speed over the ground.
So many speeds.
Right.
Back to the ASI.
Okay.
What's with those colored arcs, white, green, yellow, and red?
Those are your speed limits,
Okay.
essentially. The white arc is your flap operating range, safe speeds for takeoff and landing with the flaps down.
Go.
Green is your normal operating range. Yellow's a caution zone for smooth air only.
Uh-huh.
And red,
Red means danger, right?
Exactly.
Right.
That's your never exceed speed. Go beyond that, and you're risking serious damage.
Got it. Those colors are like visual cues telling the pilot at a glance what's safe and what's not.
Exactly.
So the ASI is all about pressure differences. What about the altimeter?
So the altimeter also relies on that pitot-static system, but it uses static pressure to determine your altitude.
Okay.
It all comes down to the fact that atmospheric pressure decreases as altitude increases.
So the higher you go, the thinner the air.
Exactly. The altimeter uses this principle with these things called aneroid wafers. They're like these tiny little sensitive metal discs that expand and contract with those pressure changes.
Huh.
So as you climb and the air pressure drops, those wafers expand,
Okay.
and that movement drives the altimeter needles to show you're at a higher altitude.
So it's like a reverse barometer.
Yeah.
Instead of measuring pressure changes to predict weather, it's using them to figure out altitude.
That's a great way to put it. But here's the catch. Air pressure isn't constant. Weather can mess with it,
Okay.
which is where the altimeter setting comes in.
Like fine-tuning it.
Exactly. Pilots use what's called the Colesman window to set their altimeter to match the local barometric pressure. Usually air traffic control will give them that.
So they're basically calibrating the instrument to the current pressure,
Exactly.
like syncing it up.
Precisely. That way, their altimeter gives them accurate readings even if the weather is being wacky.
Okay, that makes sense. But then there's different types of altitude, right? I've heard of true altitude and absolute altitude. What's the deal with all those?
You're right. There are a few different ways to think about altitude, each important for different reasons. Indicated altitude is just what you see on your altimeter. True altitude, on the other hand, is your actual vertical distance above sea level, like if you measured from the ground all the way up to your plane.
So indicated is what the instrument's telling you. True is your actual position.
Yeah.
Why the difference?
Well, variations in air pressure and temperature, those can kind of throw things off.
Okay.
So think of it like true altitude. That's the real deal. Indicated altitude is a close estimate that might need adjusting, based on those atmospheric conditions we talked about.
Right.
And then you've got absolute altitude.
Right.
That's your height above the ground directly below you.
So if you were flying over a mountain, absolute altitude is what matters.
Exactly. You don't want to be too low.
Right.
Then we also have pressure altitude, which is your height above a standard pressure level, not the ground. It's more for calculations, like for aircraft performance.
Gotcha.
And then there's density altitude, which I think you mentioned.
Right. Density altitude. Something about how air density, like thick or thin air, affects how the plane actually flies.
You got it. Density altitude is pressure altitude, but adjusted for non-standard temperature. And it's a big deal for takeoff and landing because air density affects how much lift those wings are generating.
So like thinner air at higher altitudes or hotter temperatures means you might need a longer runway to get up to speed.
Exactly. It's all connected. It's why understanding these different altitudes and how they relate to each other is so important for pilots. And speaking of important, remember how those pressure variations can affect altitude? Well, they can also play tricks on your altimeter if you're not careful.
Oh, right. There was something in the sources about high to low pressure areas and how that can really fool the altimeter readings.
Yeah, there's a classic aviation saying, going from high to low, look out below.
Catchy.
It's catchy and important
Yeah.
because if you fly from high pressure to low pressure and you don't adjust your altimeter, it can actually read higher than your true altitude.
Meaning you're closer to the ground than you think. That sounds not ideal.
Definitely not. It's all about understanding how those pressure changes, they're not just numbers, they translate to real world risks.
Right. Good reminder to pay attention to those details. Okay, so we've covered the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, both relying on pressure. What about the vertical speed indicator, or VSI?
The VSI.
How does that one work?
So the VSI, it's all about the rate of change in static pressure. It tells you how fast you're climbing or descending.
So like a speedometer, but for up and down?
Yeah, I like that.
How does it measure that change, though?
Okay, so inside the VSI, there's this diaphragm that's connected directly to the static line.
Okay.
And it's got a calibrated leak, which connects the instrument case to that static line, but at a slower rate.
Okay.
So this difference in pressure inside and outside the diaphragm caused by climbing or descending makes the needle move.
So faster you're changing altitude, bigger the pressure difference, the bigger the needle moves on the VSI.
You got it. And it's giving the pilots what we call trend information.
Trend information.
So are they climbing or descending faster or slower? And then the rate information, which is the actual rate of climb or descent in, say, feet per minute.
So it's like having this heads-up display for your climb or descent. You know what's happening right now, not just where you were a few seconds ago.
Exactly. That immediacy is what makes the VSI so valuable. Now, are you ready to leave the world of air pressure behind for a bit
Hit me.
and dive into something even more mind-bending?
Bring it on. We're cleared for gyroscopes, right? Spinning things, defying gravity.
Yeah.
I'm ready to be amazed.
Get ready to have your mind slightly boggled. Gyroscopes, they're, like I said, they're core to several key instruments,
Right.
but they operate on these principles that, honestly, can feel kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, our sources mention this rigidity in space.
Right.
And something called precession.
Yeah.
Lay it on me.
Okay, so rigidity in space.
Yeah.
This means that a spinning gyroscope wants to stay pointed in the same direction no matter how you move its base.
Really?
Yeah, picture it like a spinning top.
Okay.
The faster it spins, the less it wants to tip over.
Right.
That stability, that's rigidity in space.
So even if I tilt the base or turn it, that spinning part wants to stay stubbornly fixed.
Exactly. It's like it's defying gravity, but it's just physics. Now, precession, this is where it gets really weird. Imagine you're pushing on that spinning gyro.
Okay.
It's not going to move directly where you push. It moves at a 90-degree angle to that force.
That sounds, I don't know, wrong, like physically impossible.
Right. It seems that way. But that's precession, and it's this principle that lets us use gyros to create instruments that measure things like turn rate.
Okay, my brain needs a minute to catch up, but I'm with you so far.
It's wild.
Now, these spinning gyros, they need power, right? How does that work in a plane?
So they can be powered by vacuum, pressure, or electrically. Vacuum systems are pretty common. They use an engine-driven pump to create suction,
Okay.
and that spins the gyro. And it's critical to monitor that vacuum pressure. You want those gyros spinning.
Got it. So let's unpack these gyroscopic instruments, starting with the turn coordinator.
Okay.
It tells you how fast you're turning and how smoothly you're doing it, right?
You're catching on quick. So the turn coordinator uses a tilted gimbal, which means it senses both roll rate and turn rate.
Okay.
And that's how it can tell if you're slipping or skidding or if you're making a nice coordinated turn.
Like a driving instructor for the sky, telling you if you're using the right amount of steering and braking.
Exactly. And a key term here is a standard rate turn, which means turning at 3 degrees per second.
Okay.
The turn coordinator actually has markings to help pilots judge this rate because it's important for a lot of maneuvers.
Okay, standard rate turn. Got it. What about the attitude indicator? This one seems pretty crucial, like an artificial horizon, right?
You nailed it. The attitude indicator shows your plane's orientation relative to the horizon. Picture a miniature airplane on a horizon bar. If the mini-plane's tilted, you are too.
So it tells you if you're level, climbing, descending, banking, basically where you are in space.
Exactly. And that's thanks to that gyro inside, which wants to keep pointing the same way, remember? Rigidity in space.
Right.
So even if you're doing aerobatics, the attitude indicator gives you this reliable reference.
Wow. And it's got a bank scale too, right? Shows how much you're banked into a turn.
Yep.
Now, some older attitude indicators, they do have limits to how far they can tilt before the gyro inside tumbles, which basically means it loses its rigidity.
So there's a danger zone, even for these instruments. What about the heading indicator? Does it work the same way?
It is driven by a gyro, but instead of showing your orientation, it shows your heading. It's like a 360-degree compass.
But doesn't the gyro just stay fixed in one direction? How does that tell you, where north is?
Good point. The gyro in the heading indicator, we set it up so its spin axis can be aligned with the Earth's axis of rotation.
Huh.
And that alignment is what allows it to maintain a fixed reference relative to true north.
So it's like it has this internal compass that never gets confused. You could say that. Now, even though these gyroscopic instruments are, pretty amazing, we can't forget about the OG of navigation, the magnetic compass.
The classic compass.
Yeah.
Still relevant in this age of gyros and GPS and everything.
Absolutely. It's simple, it's reliable, and it doesn't need any fancy power source.
Right.
A magnet always wants to align itself with the Earth's magnetic field, and that's how it works.
Elegant in its simplicity. But I've heard magnetic compasses can be prone to errors. Right, those pesky magnetic fields. I imagine a plane itself is like a big hunk of metal. It's got to mess with the compass, right?
Exactly. We call that deviation. It's the difference between magnetic north and what your compass is showing because of interference from the plane's own system.
Okay.
And then there's variation, which is the difference between magnetic north and true north.
Right.
Because remember, the Earth's magnetic field isn't perfectly aligned with those geographic poles.
So many ways a compass can be off.
Yeah.
How do pilots even use it then?
By understanding those errors. There are charts and calculations pilots use to figure out variation,
Okay.
deviation, that's minimized through a process called compass swinging.
Compass swinging.
Yeah. An aircraft technician will actually position the plane on known headings
Wow.
and adjust magnets in the compass to compensate.
So fine-tuning it to cancel out the plane's own magnetism?
Yeah, it's a bit more involved, but that's the general idea. And then, of course, during flight, pilots are constantly cross-checking the compass with other instruments and navigation aids.
Makes sense. Can't rely on just one thing. Speaking of not relying on one thing, you mentioned earlier those backup instruments, the standby system.
Right.
What happens if, like, the main instruments go haywire?
That's when those standby instruments come into play.
Okay.
It's a separate, self-contained set of instruments, and it usually includes an attitude indicator, an airspeed indicator, and an altimeter.
Like the essential flight info, just in case.
Exactly. And they run on a separate power source, often a battery. So they're independent of the main electrical system.
Oh, wow.
Think of it like the instrument panel's version of a backup generator.
Okay, that's reassuring. I'm sensing a theme here. Redundancy.
Right.
Backups upon backups. Aviation seems as much about what could go wrong as what should go right.
That's a very keen observation. Safety is absolutely paramount in aviation.
Right.
So every system has backups, and pilots, we train extensively to deal with failures. We even practice these scenarios in simulators, engine fires, instrument malfunctions,
Oh, wow.
you name it.
Yeah.
It's all about being prepared.
So you're drilled on those what-if situations,
Yeah.
building those mental models for if and when things get a little hairy.
Exactly. And we haven't even touched on the human factor.
Right.
Pilots train to recognize and overcome illusions that can actually trick our senses, especially when you're relying on instruments.
Okay, illusions, like optical illusions, but for pilots.
Kind of. One example is what we call the leans. So if you're in this prolonged gradual turn and then you level out,
Okay.
your body might still feel like it's turning, and it can make you want to lean in the opposite direction.
That sounds disorienting.
It can be. And that's why, again, we rely on those instruments to give us that accurate information, not just our senses. We cross-check, we stay vigilant, and we always remember our training.
It's like a whole other level of awareness on top of everything else. This deep dive has been amazing. Who knew there was so much to learn about all these dials and gauges?
It's just scratching the surface, really.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of aviation out there. Aerodynamics, meteorology, navigation systems.
Right.
Each one is more fascinating than the last.
I'm ready to dive deeper. For those listening who are now, hopefully, as hooked on this stuff as I am,
I hope so.
where would you suggest they go next to keep learning?
There are some fantastic books and websites out there.
Okay.
I always recommend Stick and Rudder by Wolfgang Langewiesche. It's a classic for a reason. Or you can browse the resources on the FAA website.
No, they're great ones.
And, if you ever get the chance, visit a local air museum or even take an introductory flying lesson. Experiencing it firsthand is truly unforgettable.
Great recommendations. It's clear that passion for aviation runs deep and it's contagious.
It is.
This deep dive has really driven home how much ingenuity, precision, and frankly, guts it takes to navigate the skies.
Absolutely. And maybe more importantly, it highlights the importance of continuous learning, critical thinking,
Yeah.
and trusting both our instruments and our training, which are qualities that serve us well, not just in the cockpit, but in really all aspects of life.
Beautifully said. So as we come in for a landing on this deep dive, remember, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never underestimate the power of understanding those fundamentals, whether it's the physics of flight or the complexities of your own life. Safe travels, everyone.